You read Benjamin Netanyahu's big book, Place Among the Nations, you see that the Nazi analogy comes up again and again and again. He talks about how giving up the West Bank to Palestinians would be the equivalent of Czechoslovakia giving up the Sudetenland to the Nazis. You surrender the high ground and then they take everything. This obsession with this idea that the Palestinians are not really the Palestinians, but simply the reincarnation of some group of pathological Jew haters that we have seen before. What you see in the establishment Zionist narrative is that nothing fundamental in the world outside us has changed. The only thing that has changed is us, because we now have power. We have changed because we have power, and the great problem of those left-wing Jews is that they are not comfortable with power, right? They don't want us to have power. But we have changed as a result of Zionism. We now have power. But our enemies are the same. And if our enemies are the same, which is to say, they are pathologically driven to hate us for no rational reason whatsoever, irrespective of what we do, then we have no moral responsibilities to them, right? If you're sitting in the Warsaw Ghetto and you're lucky enough to get an F-16, you don't worry about your moral responsibilities to the Nazis. You use the F-16 to survive, right? And this is essentially the way in which the Israeli-Palestinian struggle, I think, is framed by the establishment Zionist narrative. Our moral obligation is to survive. And by putting Palestinians in this Amalek Nazi position, you erase their particular history, you erase their humanity. They're simply antagonists in this never-ending Jewish story. And, I think very fundamentally, you allow yourselves to believe that nothing you do politically can affect their political behavior. You can act militarily to survive, indeed you must, but nothing you do politically will change it, because nothing you did politically would change Amalek or the Nazis either, right? They're driven to hate you for reasons that have nothing whatsoever to do with what you do. I think the most sophisticated version of this argument actually comes from people who don't like settlements. There is an argument that goes, the settlements are really, really bad. Why are they really, really bad? They're really, really bad because they obscure the fundamental issue, which is that even without settlements, Palestinians would be irrevocably hostile to the existence of any Jewish presence in the land of Israel. So you hear this argument sometimes that say that the reason that the settlements are so wrong is they make people think that the problem is settlements, where the real problem is, in fact, the irredeemable Palestinian hostility to any Jewish state within any borders, and indeed, any secure Jewish community itself in the historic land of Israel. By doing something wrong, you obscure the fact that you will be hated even if you did everything right. And I want to talk a little bit about why I think this narrative, while offered by some fairly sophisticated people, not people who support everything that Benjamin Netanyahu does, why I think this argument is wrong. And I think it's wrong because it ignores the interplay between Israeli actions and Palestinian attitudes. It ignores the fact that Palestinians are not static and uniform, that Palestinian politics change in response to what Israel does. I think it's absolutely true, at least in my experience, that the vast majority of Palestinians believe Zionism is an illegitimate project. Racist, colonialist, imperialist, every bad word you could think of. And the struggle between Palestinian nationalism and Zionism historically was not a struggle over the West Bank and Gaza. It was a struggle over all of mandatory Palestine. But I think it's absolutely true, at least in my experience, as someone who reads and encounters Palestinians, that the vast majority of Palestinians, in their heart of hearts, wish that a Jewish state had never been created in their midst, and wish in their heart of hearts that they could have power over all of historic Palestine, mandatory Palestine, or at least access to all of historic Palestine. Maybe some want power over all of it, maybe some just want access to all of it. But I think that what the establishment Zionist narrative misses is that there's a difference between recognizing the moral legitimacy of Zionism and the moral legitimacy of Israel as a Jewish state, which I think very, very, very few Palestinians do, and recognizing as a political reality that you can't do anything about it. I don't think the reason the PLO started to accept Israel's right to exist starting in the late 1980s was because they all of a sudden decided that Zionism was a just movement. It's because they looked back at the last 40 years of fighting, or the last 100 years of fighting, and said, this is not working out well for us. Israel is a strong, secure, stable country, and our condition is getting worse and worse. It came out of the Palestinian recognition that the longer the fight went on, the stronger Israel got, and the worse conditions got for ordinary Palestinians. And I don't think that most American Jews understand sufficiently that for Palestinians, accepting a two-state solution in which they get, where the West Bank and Gaza, 22% of mandatory Palestine, is a tremendous and bitter defeat. But the reason there have been important Palestinians who have argued for swallowing that poisonous pill is not because they felt it was just, not because they became Zionists, but because they felt, as often happens in conflict, that the cruel weight of events forced them to accept compromises that they would rather have not accepted earlier on in earlier periods. I'm not suggesting that there is by any means a Palestinian consensus, even for this pragmatic acceptance of the two-state solution. But there are important figures, not just Mahmoud Abbas, but someone like Marwan Barghouti, for instance, who does consistently say, as far as we can tell, that he supports the two-state solution, not because he believes Zionism is just, but because he thinks this compromise, at least at this period of time, is the best, will be the best outcome for the Palestinian people. And I want to be clear about what I'm saying. I'm saying that I think there are important Palestinian voices who will accept a two-state solution along or right near the 1967 lines. It's important to recognize that is not the same thing as saying that that Palestinians will accept the Ehud Barak's offer in the summer of 2000 or Ehud Olmert's offer in 2008. The establishment Jewish narrative looks at Palestinian non-acceptance of these offers, and they say, aha, you see, they don't really want a Palestinian state if it means recognizing Israel. But I think what the establishment Zionist narrative doesn't sufficiently understand is that much of the struggle in those negotiations are actually about how much of the land inside this 22% of the West Bank Palestinians are going to have to give up in addition to having taken the 78-22% split, right? Barak, as far as we know, it's contested, but it appears that Barak wanted to annex 9% of the West Bank in the summer of 2000 and give the Palestinians 1% in return. Olmert wanted to take 6.3% and give back more, 5.7%, but he still wanted to annex Ariel, the settlement of Ariel, which for Palestinians is very, very difficult to swallow because it virtually cuts off contiguity in the northern part of the West Bank. Barak wanted to hold the Jordan Valley for 12 years. He only wanted to give Palestinian sovereignty in the outermost neighborhoods of Jerusalem. The reason I'm saying all this, and we could get further into the weeds if people wanted to question and answer, is that much of the struggle in those negotiations, not all of the struggle, but much of the struggle involves the question of how much more than the 1967 lines Palestinians are going to have to accept. And when you look at it from the Palestinian point of view, which is that you've already made this massive compromise, and then you're being asked to, of this 22%, take only a certain percentage of that, I think then you can start to see why the Israeli settlement project is so damaging. The reason Barak wanted to keep 9%, the reason Olmert wanted to keep 6.3% was not a coincidence, right? They wanted to keep those territories because Israel had built settlements that they felt they needed to annex, right? So it's been reported that Ehud Barak believed that unless he could annex 80% of settlers inside Israel, there would be civil war. He could potentially end up like Yitzhak Rabin. So the Israelis need to annex more territory in order to keep pace with the settlements that Israel is allowing and indeed subsidizing. Therefore, makes Palestinians feel that even this 22% they're getting is not really the 22%, right? They're going to have to take. They're not going to get all of Palestinian East Jerusalem. They're going to have to accept substantial settlement annexations which disrupt Palestinian contiguity near the Green Line, and they're not going to get the Jordan Valley, at least not anytime soon. And when you see it in that context, I think you can see how the Israeli settlement project then, in a way, liberates Palestinians to say, you know what? We were willing, perhaps, to make this 78-22% split. At least some of us were. But if you're saying that even that 22% is not actually going to be 22%, it's going to be significantly less than that, it's not really going to be sovereign, then screw you. Then we can go, you have actually liberated us to go back to struggle for what we wanted most deeply in the first place, which was everything. Again, whether that means control over everything, or access to everything, or some combination of both, one could discuss. But it means everything. And no matter how long it takes, and no longer how many people die. And that's why I think that while Israel, in the establishment Zionist narrative tends to assume that nothing Israel does matters to Palestinian politics because the Palestinians are the Nazis and Amalek, and they're driven to hate Jews and hate Israel for reasons that have nothing to do with us. When you actually listen and read and talk to Palestinians, especially those Palestinians most in favor of a two-state solution, what they say is you are driving people towards Hamas by discrediting those of us who are willing to make this very painful compromise. One of the people who said that most eloquently was Salam Fayyad, every Israeli's favorite Palestinian politician, who, when he left politics in 2013, said to Roger Cohen that he had failed. He said, the occupation regime is more and more entrenched, with no sign it is beginning to relinquish its grip on our life. There are more settlements, more settler violence, more intrusiveness into all aspects of Palestinian life. Our people question whether the PA can deliver, and Hamas is strengthened. Right? And so I think that what the establishment Zionist narrative doesn't understand is that it's convinced itself that nothing Israel does really affects Palestinian politics, because Palestinians will oppose the existence of any Jewish state no matter what. But through that belief, that actually justifies policies that end up empowering those Palestinians who are most hostile to any compromise. So you create the nightmare that you believe already exists. You start with the assumption that the Palestinians are all Amalek and Nazis and nothing that and irredeemably opposed to any compromise, and then you do the very things that empower those Palestinians who are least open to any compromise that allows the existence of any kind of Jewish state in any borders. Okay, let me talk a little bit about the kind of left-wing anti-Zionist narrative. What the establishment Zionist narrative and the left-wing anti-Zionist narrative share is the belief that the Green Line doesn't really matter. Right? That anti-Zionists believe that Israel is one state, it's one regime based on Jewish supremacy, and that the differences in the way that supremacy expresses itself between Palestinians in the West Bank who lack citizenship, Palestinians in Gaza who are under blockade, Palestinians in East Jerusalem who have permanent residency, and Palestinian citizens inside the Green Line. And I want to just say, just terminologically, I'm going to use the term Palestinian citizens, not Arab Israelis, because I think that Arab Israelis, it faces the reality that this is one Palestinian people in different places, and then the term Arab Israeli in that way kind of obscures the kind of understanding that Jews and Zionists need to have. Or anyway, so Palestinian citizens inside Israel may have citizenship, but it's second-class citizenship. So from an anti-Zionist perspective, these may be interesting, but they're fundamentally not that significant. What fundamentally matters is that you have one regime based on Jewish supremacy that expresses itself in different ways. And so for anti-Zionists, all of the attention on settlements is in some ways a diversion. Right? Settlements are not an aberration or some kind of wrong turn that Israel took after 1967. They're the natural expression of Jewish supremacy. And to focus on settlements is a way for liberal Zionists to not focus on the fundamental character of Zionism and Jewish statehood itself. The expulsion of Palestinians from their land in the West Bank is just the continuation of the Nakba that took place when Israel was created, and there was no good liberal democratic Israel that existed before Israel took the West Bank. After all, until 1966, Palestinian citizens of Israel inside the Green Line lived under military law. Let me just say, as a Zionist of a certain kind, that I think there are elements of truth in this anti-Zionist narrative. Political Zionism, as it has existed since Israel's creation, does privilege Jews over non-Jews. I don't really see how anyone can deny that. Israel gives Jewish immigrants citizenship on day one, but makes it extremely difficult, almost impossible, for Palestinians to immigrate to the state of Israel inside the Green Line. Israel has a national anthem that speaks about the Jewish soul and a flag that has a Star of David on it. These are Jewish symbols, and which helps explain why even Israel's Palestinian citizen who sits on the Supreme Court will not sing the national anthem because it speaks about an Nefesh Yehudi, and that does not represent him as a Palestinian citizen of the state of Israel. And beyond that, more practically, in almost every government since Israel's creation, Palestinian parties have not been part of the governing coalition because there is a belief that an Israeli government needs a Zionist majority. Now, they managed to include the Haredim, even though the Haredim aren't always so Zionist. But the Palestinian parties are not included in these governing coalitions, which helps explain why Palestinians end up on the short end of the stick in all kinds of resource allocations. And I'm here talking about inside the Green Line. I'm here talking about what's happening in the West Bank. So, as I said, I'm a Zionist of a certain kind, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. But I think it's important to understand that Palestinians don't have to be anti-Semites to be anti-Zionists. Given their own experience, anti-Zionism is a fairly natural position for them to hold, given the impact that Zionism has had on them. Now, you could say, well, Palestinian citizens of Israel should be happy with Zionism because, after all, look, they're much better off than people in Syria or Yemen. But that's not the way people operate. It's like saying African Americans should be happy because they're better off than people of African descent who live in Haiti and Jamaica. Right? People compare themselves to the people in the country in which they live. And so Palestinian citizens of Israel, even if they may be better off than some other people in the Arab world, are going to naturally and understandably compare themselves to the people with whom they live and come to the conclusion that the reason they don't have all the rights and opportunities of those other people is because they are not Jews living in a Jewish state. And I dare say a lot of us, if we were in their position, would come to the same conclusion. So what's my critique then of the anti-Zionist narrative? My critique is that he doesn't accord any legitimacy to the Jewish desire for national self-determination while accepting the legitimacy of the Palestinian desire for national self-determination. The struggle between the river and the sea is not only a struggle of individuals, it's also a struggle of peoples. The polls are clear that both Jews and Palestinians don't want only individual rights, they also want national rights. And the reason that support for a binational state is fairly low among both Palestinians and Jews, at least to the degree that polls can be trusted, I think is because both Jews and Palestinians genuinely desire, most of them, a state of their own that fulfills their national aspirations, and not just their desire for individual rights. So yes, it's true that Jews want a state that privileges Jews in certain ways, in its immigration policy, in its national symbolism, but most Palestinians, I think, want a Palestinian state that privileges Palestinians. If you look at Article 4 of the Palestinian Constitution of 2003, it said, quote, Islam is the official religion in Palestine. The principles of Islamic Sharia shall be the main source of legislation, even though that document also talks about respecting freedom of religion for all peoples. So you see that in the Palestinian project, you are also dealing with a tension between the desire for representation of a particular community, in this case particularly who overwhelmingly of one religion, and some belief that you need to have liberal and democratic principles. And this is not even unique to Zionism or Palestinian nationalism. There are dozens of democracies around the world that we would see as democracies.